Hey guys, welcome back. We're into February, and to me, that means we are officially kicking off shed season. That's right. Tonight, I'm going to share my 9 best tips to find more shed antlers. Drop any questions you might have in the chat, and we'll get into those towards the end of the stream. So, my number one best tip, or number one on the list, not necessarily the best tip, but know the local laws. First things first, ensure shed hunting is allowed in the area that you intend to shed hunt before you start shed hunting. Many states, localities, wildlife management areas, they have designated shed seasons, and some of those out west are to prevent stress on vulnerable animals. And some areas are permanently closed to shed hunting, for example, Yellowstone National Park. So, when in doubt, read the regulations for the target area or contact your local conservation officer or game warden if you have any doubts at all about what's legal in your area. Number 2, timing. If you're new to shed hunting, you may not know when to start looking for shed antlers. A lot of factors can influence when a buck or out west a bull will shed their antlers. Geography, winter severity, age class, genetics, injuries, predators. However, throughout the Midwest and the northern reaches of the West, the majority of bucks will begin shedding their antlers around late January or early February, which is right now and why I'm doing this episode. Nearly all deer will be shed by the end of March, although there are always exceptions. You see some hanging on in April once in a while, but the majority of them will be down by the end of March. And for elk, the shedding generally occurs between the first part of March and the end of April. Kind of interesting, at least it was to me, that elk grow some of the biggest antlers. They're out of velvet earlier than deer, and they shed a lot later than deer. So they grow all that antler in a shorter time period, which is pretty crazy. For deer sheds, I like to start searching around the first weekend in March, assuming most or all the snow is melted off. However, this year in Montana, we're having a super mild winter. Like, for example, this last weekend, it was 55 degrees both days where I live. There's no snow, and that's pretty uncommon. So this year, if this weekend coming up is still pretty warm, I plan to get out this weekend. And right now, there are probably more whitetails shed than not shed here. They seem to shed a little earlier in Montana than they do in the heart of the Midwest. So I would imagine 60% of them are off already. And I like to wait until at least the 50-50 mark to get going. For elk sheds, I like to start the first weekend in April, and for the same reason. You'll get some bigger bulls shedding early March, mid-March, but the majority of them are going to happen after April 1st. So that's why I usually target the last week of March, first week of April to get heading out. However, if the ground that I'm looking for has got an abundance of competition from other shed hunters or rodents that like to eat the sheds, then I may start a little earlier on those specific pieces. And sometimes I'll even go back to certain pieces twice, hit them once early if I think half the deer are still carrying, and then I'll hit them again 2 weeks to 3 weeks later and see if anything else is showing up in that time, especially if there's sign or I picked up sheds the first time through. So don't delay your shed hunting too long. New growth, green growth, depending on where you live, that could start in March, that could start in April, definitely by May. That green growth will grow up around the antlers, starts to obscure them. They get a lot harder to find, especially in areas of thick undergrowth or tall grass along cattails, things like that. So tip number 3 is to train your eyes. Toss an antler over your shoulder into the natural world. Turn around, try and find it. Throw it in leaves, tall grass, cattails, next to a pine tree, next to a tree trunk, in the middle of cornstalk stubble. You'll be surprised, even when you know it's there, how difficult it can be to find, but that can help train your eye. And that's something that I started doing early on as a new shed hunter, and I found it to be incredibly helpful. Another tip is to look small to score big. Everyone wants to find a giant antler, but I found training my eyes to look for small to average antlers helps me find more. And to look for antler shapes, just the tip of a tine, the curve of a main beam, looking for the shape of a burr. When you toss the antlers out, too, look at them at different angles. They're not always tines up. You find them tines down. A lot of times you find them facing away from you where you're just looking at the burr. So get used to looking at antlers from different angles out in out in the woods and out on the ground that you're going to be shed hunting at. That can be pretty helpful. Tip number 4 is shed hunting gear. Now, you don't need any specific gear, but these are some of the things that I like to take along to make my shed hunts last a little longer and be a little more comfortable. I put a list of some of this gear in the video description, so won't be a surprise here. Number 1, if you watched the episode last week about elk hunting, I talked a lot about boots. Boots are super important, and they're super important when you're shed hunting for the same reason. So a comfortable pair of boots, it's essential. Even in premium antler-rich areas, which are rare, it's common to walk 2-3 miles per shed. When I'm exploring new areas, that number can rise to 5, sometimes 10 miles per shed. So comfortable footwear is a must. You're going to be covering a lot of ground if you're serious about it. And I talked about it last week, but I prefer the Kenetrek Mountain Extremes or the Lathrop & Sons Mountain Hunters, but any comfortable, well-fitting boot will do the trick. Number 2, and maybe in this particular pursuit, shed hunting more important than the boots, is binoculars. So inevitably, serious shed hunting involves miles and miles of walking. A pair of quality binoculars are worth 100 times their weight. My binocular choice these days, Vortex Razor HD. I just have one pair, so I've got 12 powers because I use them for hunting a lot. For shed hunting, I probably really like an 8 or a 10 power, but I'm not buying 2 pairs. But if you're buying a specific pair just for shed hunting, 8 or 10 power would be a good idea. I use my binoculars every single time I shed hunt religiously. In the distance, is that flicker a white tine or a stick? Is that the curve main beam? Is it a tree branch? Is it a sage root? If it's 50 yards or plus away, I'm looking with the binoculars every time, the first time. And then if it still looks like an antler, then I'm going to investigate on foot. The other nice thing about binoculars, especially in open country like Montana, is if you want to take a break for a while, you can get on a high vantage point and you can just glass. Found tons of sheds doing that, and some of those have been hundreds of yards away where I would have never found them with just, looking with the naked eye. So do not forget your binoculars if you're going shed hunting, even in heavier timber or understory areas. It just saves you so much walking. Can't overemphasize how important binoculars are. Again, probably the number 1 piece, or tied for the number 1 piece of gear with boots. Number 3 on my gear list is a backpack. While it might seem impossible as a new shed hunter, there may be days when you find more antlers than you can physically carry in your hands. That's why strapping on a backpack is a great idea. These days, personally, I'm using a Kafaru 44 mag. That's a bigger back. That's kind of like my 3-day pack. I use that for elk hunting. It's a frame pack with a pretty decent sized bag. It's overkill, but it's my do everything bag. That's the main one I have, so that's what I use. And while I don't own one, there's packs like the Horn Hunter, the full curl. Those are specifically designed for shed hunting, and especially elk sheds, where you can wrap the sides of the pack around the antlers. And they're basically just a frame pack with 1 or 2 pockets for gear, and then the rest of the pack's designed to hold sheds. The backpack's great. It's a convenient way to take along water, which is important, snacks, spare batteries, or any other items that could extend your time in the field. If you're going to be out all day, take your jet boil, take a lunch, whatever. So backpack is super important. The other thing I like to use is GPS app of some sort, either a physical GPS, or everybody's using Onyx or Spartan Forge or Hunt Stand. When I find an antler, especially elk, especially bigger elk or bigger deer, I like to mark that spot, and then I try to grid search around that to match up the other side. Elk specifically, older ones, bigger ones. I think I read an article that something like 80% of the matches are within 500 yards. So if you spend some time and you've got a waypoint where you found one side, your odds of finding the other side are super high. Doesn't happen as often with deer. Deer will carry a single side a lot longer than an elk will, but it can. And I think it's probably something, I'm guessing here, half mile to 3/4 of a mile, you'd find 50% plus of a match too. So if it's a really special antler and you're trying to match it up, mark it, use your GPS app to grid search. And the other great thing is you can go back in future years to specific points that you found sheds and see if they're holding sheds again. Last thing in the gear for me is batteries, battery banks. So if your navigation instruments, your cell phone, your handheld GPS run on Batteries, the way mine do, running out of battery is a great way to cut a day of shed hunting short. In a worst case scenario, that could mean maybe you get lost. I also carry at least one set of spare batteries for my handheld GPS, or these days, I'm not personally, I wrote some of these tips a while ago. I don't have a handheld GPS. I use Garmin InReach for emergency texting and last minute navigation. I have a Garmin watch now that's got like a breadcrumb trail like Onyx does, so I'll turn that on. And then I also use Onyx, so I've got like 3 different digital things, and I still carry a regular old compass in my bag too. Haven't had to use that in a long time, thankfully, but it's in there. And I bought a nicer one. I can't remember the name of that one right now. But don't use the little globe ones or the super cheap ones. Those get you in trouble. Get something that's decent, and you can buy a pretty good compass for $30-$40. Tip number 5 is, then we're getting into the meat and potatoes here. Tip number 5 is search high odds areas. The truth is antlers can fall off anywhere in the winter range. However, that doesn't mean all areas are created equal. In my opinion, here are the best places to find sheds. Number 1, no surprise, bedding areas. Deer and elk spend a good portion of their day bedded in colder climates. Much of that bedding will occur on south-facing bedding locations if you got any topography, so any hillsides that still offer adequate security cover. So they're not going to be bedded out on open faces. I mean, elk will sometimes, but typically even elk, they want to be in some sort of security cover. And they're out there trying to stay warm. And I would say that listen to me now, well over 50% of the sheds that I've found were located in bedding areas with southern exposure. And specifically, I found that things with southeastern exposure are even better, because typically in Montana, we get a lot of north and west winds during the winter. So southeast gets them in the sun and out of the wind. So it's a super high odd spot, especially for mule deer in hilly areas. Elk as well. The whitetails, not as much, just because the whitetails I'm finding are usually in lower land habitats, and they're not as diverse topographically. So after bedding areas, again, this shouldn't be any surprise in the winter. Preferred food sources. One of the best ways to anticipate where shed antlers might end up is to keep an eye on where bucks or bulls are feeding right now. So late January, February, into March. Take note if you're seeing local herds, what are they on right now? Are they on a cornfield that you're by? Are they in dogwood? If it's a bull, are they on a feed ground? That's legal in some western states like Wyoming. So it's finding the herds, whether that's deer herds, elk herds right now. That's probably the single best way to up your odds of a successful shed hunt. So scour the food sources nearest to the bedding areas. And since food and bedding areas will count for the majority of an animal's day, that's where I spend my time when I'm shedding, is what are they eating? What are they feeding on? I'm going to check standing cornfields. If there's any left, that happens on wet years sometimes. Cut cornfields. CRP, it's a great bedding area, and it's got a lot of diverse browse that deer eating in the winter. They're not just going to ag fields or leftover ag fields, so CRP is great habitat to find sheds. It's a little tougher shed hunting because it's taller, but even in there, just follow the deer trails. There's usually deer trails on CRP, and that's where you're going to find the majority of the sheds. Winter wheat and out west, haystack yards. So a lot of times the stack yards will just have a one or, like a 3-strand fence around them, barbed wire fence. And if you can get access to private land that's got a stack yard, or even sometimes public land will have a stack yard meaning stacks of hay, that's a great place to find sheds too. You got to beat the ranchers there though. And that means being there if you have permission or on the public. Next, after bedding and feeding areas, I'm looking at transition areas. In this case, I'm defining a transition area as the primary travel route between the winter bedding area and that winter preferred food source. So if I've covered the bedding area, if I've covered the food source, again, a lot of times that'll be like a corn stubble field. My next stop is the areas between them. So check any well-used, obvious trails. A lot of times, bucks and does during the winter are using the same trails. So the track should clue you in, but look at any heavily used trails. Fence lines, unlike bedding areas, which may be hard to pinpoint without previous knowledge of an area, fence lines are super easy to identify. I'll walk down fence lines anywhere near a bedding area or anywhere near a feeding area, and I'll just look for tracks or trails. crossing in, and then I'll start following those both ways. So fence lines are a great place to start if you don't know the area that well, and then walk those either into the food source or back into the bedding area. And then similarly, but less obvious, obstacles. So much like fence lines, obstacles down trees, low-hanging branches, steep embankments, especially creek crossings. These all provide an opportunity to knock loose an antler that's hanging on by its last thread. So those are some of the primary areas that I'm going to hit. And with that in mind, what am I going to do next? Tip number 6, miles for piles. That is the name of the game with shed hunting. That's why the boots are important. So I probably average one shed every 2.5 miles. And for a while it was lower because I was closer to maybe a mile and a half. Because the first couple of years there was a lot of deer in Montana and I was finding a ton of sheds. The last 3 years it's been tough. Deer numbers are about half of what they were when I moved here. And with that, there's half as many sheds. The age class has gotten worse, so there's smaller sheds. Those are harder to find. That's a lot easier to find a shed like that or like that than it is to find a shed off a year-old buck. So there's no way around it. Whether it's your first shed, your 100th shed, your 1,000th shed, it's just a game of miles. You got to stay focused, but the longer you walk in the areas I just discussed, those high odds areas, the more sheds you're going to find. And it shouldn't be a surprise. I talked about fitness last week's stream about elk hunting. Here it is again. The better shape you're in, the more sheds you're going to find, period. Number 7, stay focused. If finding an antler is really your goal, it won't help to be thinking about the project at work, your mortgage, what's for dinner tonight. When I'm shed hunting, I try to keep my eyes focused on the ground and my brain focused on the shape of the antlers that I'm after, whether that's elk, mule deer, whitetail, whatever. Keep that in your mind. Try to enjoy your time out there, but stay focused on what you're doing, and what you're doing is shed hunting. I mean, I will look for sign, and I'm doing a little scouting too, but if I'm out specifically shed hunting, I'm looking for sheds. If I find myself losing focus, I like to stop and pause. A lot of times I've found antlers by turning around, looking behind me. The orientation of a shed or where it fell off on the backside of an obstacle might be difficult to find from one direction, but it's easily visible from the opposite direction. So stop, regularly look back. I'm not in a big hurry when I'm shed hunting. I think my average speed's like 1.5 miles an hour. So going pretty slow, really trying to cover the ground. And I'm always running my tracking app, which I talked about earlier. So if I do get into sheds, I can come back to that area, and let's say I run out of miles for that day or just getting dark. I'll come back a day later, 2 days later, and I'll try to make a bigger loop in that area if I'm getting into stuff. If I'm not, vice versa, if there's no sign, then I'll just abandon those areas for the season. Tip number 8, remember where you found these sheds. So one of the fun things to do about shed hunting, for me anyways, take photos, take videos. It's a great way to remember exactly what the shed looked like when you found it. And when I get home, my bigger sheds, especially ones that are special to me, I like to tag them. So I'll put a date on them. I put the location where I picked them up. It's a fun reminder. It's also a valuable piece of information when it comes to late season hunting. A lot of these places you're picking up sheds are going to be where these animals are hanging out towards the end of the legal hunting seasons. So that's valuable information and something I'm tracking. Anytime also I pick up a shed, I like to focus on the characteristics of that spot. Again, especially if it's a big shed or an animal that I think I might be interested in chasing that fall. Why was it there? What's special about that winter habitat? What's the food source like that year? If it's near an ag field, what was the crop rotation? I like to mark all that stuff down. And it's so easy these days if you're using a GPS app on your phone. Almost all of them have note sections, have picture sections. You know, add that shed in as a picture waypoint. Take a note. Most of the waypoints are time and dated, so you don't have to do that. But what's the wind like? How long ago do you think that shed fell off? Where was it at in the topography? Was it on one of those southern slopes? Do you think that deer's local based on the habitat around there? So keep all that stuff in mind. That's all tools in your toolkit for the following late season. And then my last tip, and this one's helped me find a couple areas where I've have gotten into some really good shed hunting. The following years, it's been really good too. So that's revisit areas that have held sheds previously. And that's why I was getting into at the end of tip number 8, drop a pin. To take it to the next level, I recommend keeping those thorough notes throughout the year, keeping those GPS waypoints. There's a good chance an area that held antlers this year could produce again under similar conditions in the future. So do as good as you can to keep track of all that information. Again, those conditions and those variables that are in that area that year. And that'll be a big producer. So I've got one area particularly that I've found. It's a big area, 10, 15,000 acres. It's all public land, and it's an obvious mule deer wintering ground. Of my 200 and some sheds I've probably found 60 of them in that 10 to 15,000 acres over the last 5 years. So it's been a really, really good producer year over year, and that's an area that I hit every year and look forward to hitting. So let's see if we got any questions today. Tom Heinen says, Western North Dakota offered some fun shed hunting for a Michigander. Hey, Tom, good to see you. Yeah, Western North Dakota is similar to tons of central Montana habitat. If you get along the Little Missouri in Western North Dakota, you got kind of that Badlands breaks type habitat, and that's great habitat. Western North Dakota, specifically that area, you can find whitetail sheds in the river bottoms. You can find mule deer sheds in the hillsides around that. If you're super lucky, maybe you'd find a bighorn sheep skull. There are bighorn sheep in that area. There's also, a lot of people don't know, Western North Dakota does have a smaller elk population too. So you could find some elk sheds in there too. Looks like that's going to do it for the questions tonight. So just wanted to jump on here since it is getting to be what I would consider the very front end of prime shed hunting season. Give you some of the tips that have worked for me, and wish you guys good luck out there this fall. If you guys get any sheds, send me a picture on social media. Always like to see a big shed. And good luck. Hope some of this stuff helps you out on your adventures. Thanks for tuning in, guys.